So let us know when we are live on air.
You are.
We are. Okay. All right, great. So let's get started and welcome everybody to this webinar on the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Tim Christoffersen. I work for UNEP, where I'm the focal point for the UN Decade, and together with my colleagues here at UNEP and at FAO, the other lead agency for the decade, we would like to give you all an update today on our state of preparations and on how you can get involved. We are holding this webinar on Teams Live, which means that you can post questions or comments in the chat at any time. My colleagues Oscar and Aline are monitoring the chat, and we will also post a few polling questions later, which we hope you can all participate in. We have a tightly packed agenda for today, and we will, in addition to this webinar, always post information on the UN Decade on our website, decadeonrestoration.org, and we will also record this webinar and post it there in a few days. Apologies that today our language for the webinar is English only. We will try to offer a similar webinar in the coming weeks, also in French and Spanish, to reach a broader audience. But thanks again for joining us today. The UN Decade is based on the principle of new power, meaning we would like to empower all of you to become part of this UN Decade and implement the strategy, and also to help us shape and guide the decade as we move along. I will soon hand over to Mette Wilkie, who is the Director of Forest Policy Division in FAO and one of the two focal points for the UN Decade at FAO. After Mette, we will hear from some of our core partners, including the secretariats of the 3 Rio Conventions, the Global Landscapes Forum, IUCN, UNESCO, the World Economic Forum, and we've also invited the youth focal points of our major groups at the UN to update us on how this decade will be relevant for the global youth. After the presentations, we will have a chance to answer your questions, which you're welcome to post anytime during the webinar on the chat. With this, I would like to hand over to Mette, please.
Thank you, Tim. Waiting to see if I coming live here. Thank you, Tim, and also a very, very warm welcome from me to all of you here today. I want to tell you a little bit about the background for United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and why we are so excited about this, and hope that you all will join us and learn a bit more of it, but also share your ideas of how we can do it and your initiatives with others, and seeing how we can really make this into a global movement, because that's what we want to achieve. So Eileen, I think, is managing the slides. So next one, please. There we go. So the idea behind the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration has a long gestation period, but it culminated last year in March when there was a UN General Assembly resolution that was put forward by El Salvador, supported by 71 other countries, to call for a decade, a UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, to prevent, halt and reverse the degradation of ecosystems. Now, very importantly, it covers all types of ecosystems, both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. And it builds on existing commitments because there is so much going on already. We already have the Paris Agreement on climate change. We have a number of countries that have committed to land degradation neutrality. We have the biodiversity targets, and we're hoping to get some new ones fairly soon. We have the Bonn Challenge of how to restore ecosystems. And there's a number of regional and smaller scale initiatives that have already started. So we want to build on those commitments. FAO and UNEP were asked to lead that implementation, but it doesn't mean that we are going to do everything. Clearly, we were also asked to work in collaboration with the Rio Conventions and other partners, and we're hoping to have as many partners on board as possible. Importantly, they're asking us to do it within our existing mandates. So for FAO, it's on food and agriculture, fisheries and forestry. And within UNEP, it's on the environment. And within our existing or voluntary resources. So clearly also need to get some funding to help put this in place. But that was sort of the background for the decade itself. Next slide, please. Why do we need this? Well, there's a number of reasons for that. And at the moment where we are in a COVID pandemic, I think we can see even more reasons for why we can do that. Because we do need to have a look at how we are arranging ourselves, what it is, what future it is that we want. We've seen that we have an opportunity here with the economic recession that's coming after the COVID crisis, where we've had a halt of activities, that we can build back better. And in order to do so, we need to make sure that we release all of the efforts that we can through nature-based solutions. And ecosystem restoration is certainly one of those. It can help with the current crisis that we have on land degradation, on biodiversity, on climate, and on the economic crisis as well. We know that land degradation negatively affects 3.2 billion people. That's a third of the global population. But we also know it has a huge economic impact, 10% of global GDP. We know from a recent assessment that we have lost a lot of our natural resources. Deforestation, for example, 420 million hectares of forest have been converted to other uses in the last 30 years. In wetlands, we've lost 70% of the wetlands in the last century, and we've had a drastic decline in coral reefs and seagrass beds. We must repair that damage done, and that's why we have the decade on ecosystem restoration. Next slide. We also know that we cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030, the future we want, unless we have a healthy biosphere as the foundation. If we don't have healthy ecosystems, we cannot have a healthy society and we cannot have a healthy economy. So it is of ultimate importance that we try to see how we can better conserve and restore the natural resources that we have. Next slide. We want to make sure that you all understand as well that it's not just about biodiversity conservation, climate change, or economic returns. Now, the benefits extend across all of the Agenda 2030. You can think of any of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I can give you a reason why ecosystem restoration responds to some of those challenges that we have there and how that can help us achieve the goals that we have across all of the Sustainable Development Goals. We know that if we do this right, we can tackle the three crises that we have in terms of biodiversity, climate, and the economy. We also know how important it is to have the natural resources and natural environment for human health. And we know that it makes sense economically. We've seen cost-benefit ratios of 1 to 10 or 1 to 15. We know it costs much more to do nothing than to prevent more degradation from taking place. And if we restore the 350 million hectares under the Bond Challenge, we could generate up to $9 trillion in net benefits. Next. We also know that this is the right time to do so. We know that there is an increased awareness on environmental issues, on climate change in particular, but also on biodiversity. We know that we're not starting from zero. We're not starting from scratch. There has been a lot of work already done under the climate change agreement on reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, the countries that have their nationally determined contributions to climate change. We have a number of the Sustainable Development Goals already in place and a lot of actions happening. And we have an appetite for change, and we need to make sure that we make good use of that. We have seen that already. People are saying we need to have a different way of treating nature, in different way of having our economic development. So We want to make sure that we build on all of this. And lastly, we also know that knowledge is no longer shared top down or even sideways. A lot of it is bubbling up from below. So we are building our strategy on that to try and make sure that everybody helps share this in line with what's called the new power. Next, please. So what have we done today? Well, about a year ago, we launched a survey to see what people wanted to be included in a strategy for this decade. We had about 1,000 respondents. And then we had a large number of consultations in persons, at meetings, or virtually, both with the Rio conventions that you can see up here, but also we had them at some of the big meetings. So at the Climate Change Summit in New York last year, at some of the meetings of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration, the Global Landscape Forum, and a number of these conference of the parties. So wherever we had an opportunity, we tried to see how many people we could get in the room to ask them what they wanted to see out of this decade. And as part of that, we then developed a strategy. We launched that in February for consultation, so that people had something to react to. And we have already received about 1,500 comments. So as you can imagine, our work has been cut out. We need to come up with a final strategy, taking into account all of these many great ideas that we've heard. And we hope to release that in July. Next, please. So what is it all about? Well, we have looked at it and developed what we call a theory of change. We've looked at what is the problem. We know that we can't achieve the objectives of the 2030 agenda unless we have the natural resource base, and that means unless we have large-scale restoration of degraded terrestrial and marine ecosystems globally. That's just a fact. We then develop what we think, what is it that we want to achieve? Well, we want to have a world where we basically have restored the relationship between humans and nature. And we want to do this and increase the area of healthy ecosystems and by putting a stop to their loss and degradation. So it's more than just action on the ground. We also want a change in mindset and in behavior. And that's where we're looking to you to help give us good ideas on how we best do that. We are envisaging that we will work through 3 different pathways to achieve this vision. So the first one is this global movement, getting everybody involved and excited about this. The second one is this political will, making sure that it's possible to achieve restoration on the ground, getting the governments involved as well, and getting those that have the decision-making powers involved. And lastly, to build the capacity to make this happen. So we're hoping to have this global restoration culture where there will be hundreds of thousands, even millions of initiatives that will start and scale up across the planet. Next. So here's sort of a more detail on what it is that we want to do. You will be able to access the presentation afterwards, so you can go into detail about this, but there's a little more information about this global movement, what we want to do, as we want to sort of look at changing the societal norms and perceptions. We want to make sure that this is mainstreamed into educational systems globally, and that we catalyze investments in large-scale restoration. The political will, as I said, was a bit more about policy reforms and working across governments and seeing if we can get some champions from heads of states, ministers of finance, planning and development, those who have the power to make the decisions to make this happen. And thirdly, of course, the capacity. So methods for how to help countries and individuals, smaller organizations to design and implement and sustainable ecosystem restoration initiatives. And that would be some capacity building, training, and particularly sharing good practices, because we know there's a lot of those out there, and we want to have a platform where we can actually share all of those among people and make sure that they're available also in other languages and so on. So as I said, it's a lot about developing this global restoration culture across the world. Next slide. We have developed a communication strategy as well, because of course it's very important to get our messages out in order to change behavior. So we're looking to see how we can connect hundreds of global partners to thousands of implementers that can reach millions across the globe. So that's where we're building on this new power and movement theory to mobilize communities of champions, to institute that behavioral change, to spearhead advocacy. And to do that, we need to have the messaging right. So we want to have good messages, good examples, and you can help us with those so we can inspire a whole new generation of restoration. I think we want to also look at seeing how we can have some partnerships for creating a really interactive digital home for the decade, so that people would see this as a platform they want to interact with, that they can get engaged with, help share their stories of what has happened, the successes and the failures, so people can learn from that and be in touch with each other and get those networks going to support initiatives on the ground. Next. So we will have hopefully a lot of people involved in this, and we're trying to see how we can best organize that. So we have the lead agencies, so that's FAO and UNEP. Then we're looking to see core partners, who they might be. So that's a smaller group that will help us drive this decade. There will then be a much, much larger group of contributing initiatives and networks, and we're really hoping that that would be enormous. And then we have these connectors that are individuals or organizations that can help us spread the message even further and develop opportunities to get people together, to have that networking and connections between those that are doing work on the ground, those who may want to fund it, those who may want just to support it, share the stories, etc. And clearly we also need to have a look at some funding and sponsors, how we can link those with initiatives on the ground. So it's not about getting funding into FAO and UNEP, it's about making sure we have that marketplace where those who need some additional funding to undertake their initiatives may meet with those who are willing to support that financially. Next. We will, of course, need a bit of funding to run the decade itself. And also perhaps to channel some of that funding to initiatives where it might be the easiest way of doing it. Not all of it, but there might be some of it that comes through that. And to do that, we're setting up what we call a multi-partner trust fund. This is a UN mechanism that will help us with getting funding in from different donors into one big pot, and then it can go out through different sort of windows, if you will. There will be one that's sort of more the global aspects of it, the communication, information and awareness. There will be one that gives support to selected flagship programs at either thematic or regional or global level. And there will be one that looks at how can we actually monitor success and report on that and see what has actually come out of this UN decade. This will be led by FAO and a joint team, and because we are mandated to and responsible to report back to the Secretary General on what we have achieved in this decade. Next. So here are some generic email contact addresses, so that if you have any questions on anything, you can just send it to one of these. And we will respond to you as soon as we have an answer, or get you to a person who can actually give you an answer to the questions that you have. But clearly here today, we are also hoping that you have put some questions already in the chat box, and that we have an opportunity to respond to those as well. And I believe that's the end of my part of it, but we have some partners who would also like to say a few words. So thank you for now.
Thank you so much, Mette, and we thought it would be useful that Mette gives you this quite detailed overview of the strategy and of the preparations, because some of you might be new to the decade process, which indeed has been going on for about a year, and we've come quite far, but there's still some work to do, as Mette outlined. We are now coming to the next part of the webinar, where we will give the 3 Rio conventions the chance to speak, the CBD, the UNCCD, and the UNFCCC, followed by the forum at IUCN, at UNESCO, and the World Economic Forum. We've given everybody the almost impossible task to stick to 3 minutes and 1 slide. And if you can imagine something as complex as, for example, the UN Convention on Combating Desertification, which is more or less all about stopping and reversing restoration, that is quite a heavy order. So I want to thank Louise Baker, who will start us off, for accepting this challenge and putting everything on 1 slide. So thank you so much, Louise, and over to you. I have 1 quick announcement for our colleagues at CBD, World Economic Forum, UNESCO. If you're in the audience of this Microsoft Teams Live, then please click on the other link we sent you to your calendars, which means you will be among the panel, because we cannot give you the right to speak unless you're on that link. So thank you. Over to you, Louise, please.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Mette. I think hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm going to hopefully be very brief, and give you a sense of excitement that we here at UNCCD share about the launch of the decade. As Tim said, this is very much in line with the work that we're doing at UNCCD, and we are 100% behind it in every way that we can be. Our major contributions, I suppose, are in the area of land degradation neutrality, which is 15.3 in the SDG targets and goals. It's, I guess, a way of getting, I hope, getting things right in the landscape level, doing the right thing at the right place and the right scale. So it isn't just for dry land areas, I hope, that UNCCD is working on and prioritising, but I hope within the context of LDN, we can look at Ramsar and the wetland areas, we can look at brownfield sites and the relationship with restoring land to support cities. So far, there are 120 countries who've committed to set LDN targets with large restoration components in them. We're getting close to 500 million hectares there of commitments from countries on restoration. Those numbers are still emerging, but it's getting up there. As you see here, we have a fund available that's a private sector fund, and we think bringing in the private sector into the restoration agenda over the course of the next 10 years and over the course of the decade, and making that the new normal, that the private sector also invests in restoration, will be critical to the success of this exercise. Our COP in particular has focused on an enabling environment to make this happen. So restoration will be a success, I'm sure, if we invest in it, but in order to make it happen, we need to get the enabling environment right. That's addressing things like tenure that encourages restoration, taking into account issues around gender, so that those issues are part of the discussion around restoration as well. We have some interesting projects taking place on the ground. We're not implementing, but through our partners, we've got some interesting projects that we're supporting at scale. The Great Green Wall, the 3S initiative, which is focusing on green jobs and the value of restoration to creating green jobs, and restoration to bring cross-border peace is a new initiative that will be launched fairly soon too. So there's some initiatives that we hope that will be a useful kind of flagship projects for us. Where I would ask for some help is that one of our main projects that we plan to contribute is the Global Land Outlook, which is our kind of scoping piece for the strategic communications piece, which for the 2nd edition will have a focus on restoration. There are a number of consultancy requests out at the moment for consultants to help us frame the Global Land Outlook. So if you can contribute intellectually, we are looking to speak to you now. And I think all of this leads to a new social contract for nature and sort of a transition to the restoration economy. Totally agree. Normal is what got us into this mess in the first place. We don't want to go back to normal. We want to go back to something better, and restoration should be the new normal. So there you go. That's my 3 minutes. Thank you. Really
perfect. Thank you very much, Louise, and thanks to all of the colleagues at UNCCD and also to Ibrahim Chow for being such strong supporters of the decade and working well together with us as a team. I'm looking at the questions here, and one came in that was relevant to your presentation. Karin Zaunberger from the European Commission, hi Karin, asked if we can link this to the G20 initiative on land restoration, and maybe Louise, you want to add that to your points, because that is already happening, although of course in times of COVID-19 we don't know how exactly that initiative will pan out.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. We've definitely been engaged. We continue to engage with the G20 Secretariat and the team in Saudi Arabia on that. So we're engaging with mostly from that side, from the Saudi side, and providing them with any technical responses that they need and any information that they need to take that forward. It's definitely something that came up in the initial Ministers of Environment meeting, and we hope that the outcome from September will include a restoration initiative, or a restoration initiative at this stage, but a land restoration initiative coming out of September. What we don't know is what that will look like yet. So we have high hopes that there will be a G20 commitment of some sort on restoration. Whether that will come with any financing, or what that financing might look like, or how they translate the political commitment, we don't know, but it's definitely something that we're encouraging and would like them to do, and happy to provide any offline additional information to people who need it. No problem.
Great, thank you very much, Louise. I've picked one other question from the chat which came up, that restoration networks already exist, and we have the Society for Ecological Restoration, Wetlands International. These are all also partners of the UN Decade, and in fact the Society for Ecological Restoration principles are at the basis of our strategy, and the next SER conference will have the UN Decade as its topic in 2021. So indeed, this is an umbrella where everybody working on restoration can join us, and we all want to work together towards a common joint vision and the strategy. With that, thanks again to Louise, and we move on in Bonn, just across the street, and thematically from land degradation and sustainable land management to climate change. Peter Iversen is our focal point at the UNFCCC Secretariat. Peter, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thanks for organizing this webinar. So, as Louise, the UNFCCC is also, of course, very supportive to the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration, because basically it aligns very well with what we also need to achieve on the climate change agenda. I think this was made very clear last year by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the report, special report on land on climate change, where the importance of land, both in terms of mitigation, because there's a lot of mitigation potential, but certainly also in terms of adaptation. And actually these two things are very linked when we come to land. It highlights a lot about the values of ecosystem restoration in this report. For our work, where we can say we contribute, or what is happening, is that under the Paris Agreement, 2020 is the year for new and updated national determined contributions. This is where parties to the Paris Agreement will say what they will do to meet the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. This again could easily include a lot about, well, it should actually include about land use. Also, 2020 is the year for parties to submit what we call long-term low-carbon development strategies. This is with an outlook to 2050. Again, what they will do in terms of sort of achieving this low-carbon development. And again, of course, land use, ecosystem restoration could be a key factor here. Also, very new, it's not in this slide, is that you all know, because of the COVID-19, a lot of things has been postponed. Today, the United Kingdom announced that the COP26 that will take place in Glasgow will now take place in November next year. So now we're looking forward to that. In the meantime, a lot of work is, of course, still happening because a lot of work are happening on the ground. And here the Climate Change Secretariat have the mandate to conduct reviews, technical assessment, analysis, etc. of what is happening and what parties are submitting to us. And in particular, I would like to highlight what we are doing on RED+, which is about reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, because this relates very much to ecosystem restoration. Here we are receiving more and more submissions. This year we had 15 of what we call these forest reference emissions levels, which is basically for countries to assess, to use as a benchmark for assessing the progress they do. This brings the total number of submissions up to 60. We cover, I would say, more than 70% of all the forest now in developing countries. We actually also had to postpone this process a little bit. So instead of doing it in March, when we were first hit by the COVID-19, now we have postponed it to June, but then it will really take place and it will start next week. Also, we are receiving, because of course that is also important, to receive the results that actually countries are having positive results in RED+. Here we also see more and more submissions, and this is also a process that we keep on doing together with many other review and technical assessment process. I think this is what I can share, what we do that is really relevant for the ecosystem restoration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. While you were presenting, I'm also monitoring the chat, because the questions and comments are now coming in fast and furious here, which is great. We have over 300 people now in the audience, so please keep it coming. If we don't get to answering your questions on this call, we will aim to put up a document in a few days which addresses your questions. Let me just pick out some here. How would we maintain momentum? Somebody is posting here that UN decades come and go, but what will make this one different? How will we maintain the momentum? And I think, Peter, linking it to these policy processes which will ensure that there's a continuous policy focus on these issues is one way to do it. And the Rio Conventions, other biodiversity related conventions, other multilateral environmental agreements are of course key to that. Would you be able to shed a bit of light on how to keep the momentum? Of course, there are many facets to that issue, and other panelists later will be invited to come in on that. But how do we keep the momentum going for something like this?
I think at least I think our experience is that the reporting of countries, and it does not have to be countries, but in our case it's the parties to the convention, Paris Agreement, etc. When they report on what they do, and there's actually a technical assessment to look into this, and there's a publication report coming out, this makes it very visible what is happening. It both make it visible, sort of the success stories, but of course it also makes it visible that if we are not moving fast enough, I mean, for this, for example, under the Paris Agreement, we have this global stock take that will take stock of where we are compared to where we should be. And this is a way to keep on sort of reminding all of us that, okay, we are here, but we need to get there, we need to do more. So at least this is one way, and I guess this could also be used not only how we use it in our process, but also other processes when it comes to reporting and setting goals, because we have a lot of goals also in terms of that are very relevant for the ecosystem restoration process.
Excellent. Thank you very much again, Peter, and thanks also to you and Luis for being so concise. We next would like to come to the CBD. They're having difficulties to dial into the presenters function of Microsoft Teams. Apologies for that. But if you could, Aline, just go briefly to the slide that our colleagues from the CBD Secretariat sent us, so we can at least share the update on the key decisions and the key links to the CBD process, then that would be helpful. If you go back one more, so we can at least show the slide that they've prepared, unless Lisa or Alexander, who are our focal points at the CBD, have joined us at this stage. It doesn't seem to be the case. Then we would, as we had them also update the UNEP team yesterday on the same slide, perhaps I can just highlight that the CBD decision at COP14 in a sense paved the way for the UN decade to be adopted at the General Assembly. We have ongoing initiatives under the Convention on Biological Diversity on restoration, but even more importantly, the current post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework has a draft target for 2030, and that is related to restoration. We of course all hope and support CBD colleagues that in 2021 at COP15 in China, a strong global biodiversity framework can be adopted with a restoration target. There's also links to a question that came up on the chat. I will just summarize that question. What are the goals of the UN decade? So does the UN decade have a goal of 1 billion hectares or something like that? And we had a long debate about that with these core partners. And in the end, what we set out in the strategy is that we don't lack targets in the world. We don't lack agreement on what to do. We lack doing on what has been agreed. So what the decade does is it takes all the existing targets from the CBD, the UNCCD, the UNFCCC that relate to ecosystem restoration from the SDGs. There are specific restoration targets directly in the SDG on water, in the SDG on oceans, life below water, in the SDG on life on land. So we take those targets that are very ambitious and we support them. We also support, as the UN decade, all these regional initiatives that have set themselves the very ambitious goal to actually promote restoration on the ground in regions. And I see Paola Agostini is on the chat from the World Bank, and for example, the new initiative for Central Asia, the ECA 30, we have the AFR 100, the Africa Restoration 100 initiative in Africa. Those are the regional initiatives that we will support, and we will support your targets. So the decade is there to support your target, not set a new one. And we will also hear, hopefully from IUCN, if Adriana managed to log in briefly on the Bonn Challenge in a few minutes. So with that, we would like to move on to the next brief presentation and update from the Global Landscapes Forum. And I believe Salina has made it through the difficult login requirements here for Microsoft Teams on the panelists. Salina, please over to you. And if you can go to the slide from the GLF, please.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I have the pleasure of introducing everyone to the Global Landscapes Forum. And the GLF is the world's largest knowledge-led platform on sustainable land use. And our big picture mission is essentially to positively impact over 1 billion people through the creation of sustainable landscapes. And for us, this means that we're making landscapes equitable, resilient, profitable, and productive. It's a big vision, but I think it's what our Earth is asking for. It's what we need to do. So in sum, the GLF was founded in 2013 as a partnership between the UN Environment, the World Bank, the Center for International Forestry Research. And since then, we've really exploded to include 22 charter members of many of the most influential organizations working on landscapes across the globe, from mountains, peatlands, agricultural lands, and drylands. Essentially all the ecosystems we want to protect and restore in the next 10 years. And we partner with farmers, organizations, women, indigenous, and youth groups to ensure that the action we take is informed by traditional knowledge and that rights are respected. So in short, the GLF is a global community of practitioners that work along the motto, connect, share, learn, and act. So to connect and build a community of change agents from the grassroots to the politicians, to share knowledge and ideas, to learn good practices collaboratively, and then to act together in community. So for the UN Decade, the GLF is really excited about bringing in new voices. Since we are owned by no one and everyone at the same time, we hope to make sure that the UN Decade is truly inclusive. It's a decentralized movement. From the indigenous group in Chad to the World Bank, they all join in conversation in GLF events. And this is why we will be hosting global summits and events which help shape the narrative on the UN Decade. So to share the general message on the importance of a holistic, integrated landscape approach, but also to dive deeper as needed to talk about agricultural subsidies or new insights on monitoring restoration. In addition, we're really excited about being able to support local action. So this year, we're launching GLFX, which brings the collaborative spirit of these global forums and high-profile events to local communities. So this means that the 79-year-old man who we talked to last week, who's restoring land in Pakistan, can start a GLFX local chapter because he wants to gather a diverse group to bring in new voices and help someone take on his legacy. So if you're excited about taking that type of action and jumping into this space, you can definitely apply to start a GLFX chapter or join one near you. We also plan on continuing the growth of our Youth and Landscapes initiative, really supporting and empowering youth actors in restoration through a new program called Generation Restoration. And then lastly, for those who are new to restoration, who want to get involved, but need a really substantial knowledge base or want to learn more, we have our online Landscape Academy. So this is a great time in quarantine to start jumping in. They're hosted at edX. It's also a partnership with UN Environment. If you want to take a month-long course on landscape leadership, on finance, on biodiverse landscapes or governance. So this is a great opportunity for people to really build on the GLF motto of connect, share, learn, and act. And for those who want to get a taste of GLF, we're also hosting a 3-day conference next week on food in the times of crisis. And later on in the year, really diving in deeper on restoration. So quite excited to be involved with the UN Decade and to continue working together with everyone. I think that's my 3 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Salina. And indeed, great to have the GLF with its outreach and knowledge exchange capacity amongst our partners. While you were presenting, questions really are streaming in now beyond the participants in this call. Maybe we'll group a few of these and then later give them to all panelists to choose from. One that I thought was particularly relevant to the GLF is basically the question, how can we get involved? And I think you already presented GLFX as one opportunity to get involved. There are others. And we will also build together with our partners a digital hub for the UN Decade. And that might hopefully also enable us to keep the momentum going, because the momentum will be in implementation and not in the setting of a strategy or these kinds of targets. Salina, thanks. We'll come back to all the panelists later with some questions. Please help me keep tracking the chat because there's so many questions that stream in. So if you see any of our panelists that you think is particularly relevant for you, please pick that up after the round of presentations now. Unfortunately, also our colleague Adriana Vidal from IUCN had difficulties connecting. Arun, if you are on the call, Justin Adams and also Adriana need the link again for logging in as a presenter. They were not able to connect, which is of course a pity because IUCN is one of the key partners, not only in the decade now, but in preparing all of us for getting this far. And clearly IUCN has, with the bond challenge, with the 173 million hectares of pledges under the bond challenge, been active in the space for 10 years and really made it possible for all of us to get to this stage. Let me check once more if Adriana is now in the call. I can't see her yet. I can see Justin has now been able to join, and Norleen from UNESCO. So we'll go to our next two core partners, and then we'll come back to IUCN, and hope by then Adriana will be able to log in. So we change over to UNESCO, who we are very excited to have as a core partner, not only on education, but also on ecosystem management. And Noeline Roundry will talk us through what they will contribute to the decade. Thank you, Noeline, and over to you.
Good afternoon, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for organizing this webinar. What UNESCO will be doing during the UN decade. First of all, I have to say that we are very excited to be co-partner to the UN decade. And you all know that UNESCO is the UN Agency for Education, Science, Culture, and Communication and Information. So I think that all these sectors are very relevant for the UN decade. What I want to say is that the UN decade will be implemented through existing processes, through existing programs, through existing networks. So we should not reinvent the wheel. And what UNESCO is wanting to contribute to is to really have a real synergy with various topics. One of them is the synergy with stakeholders, and particularly with the UN agencies. We are in charge of leading the UN Decade of Ocean Science with the IOC at UNESCO, and we are looking very much to a good synergy between the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restorations and the UN Decade on Ocean Sciences. So this is something that we are very keen of. Of course, we are partnering with UN Environment, with FAO, and we have also one specific constituency, which is the youth. Can you come back to the previous slide, please? Thank you. With the youth constituency, and this is very important for us. The MAB Youth Forum is very active, and we have youth constituency all over UNESCO. With regard to conventions, we have also several conventions at UNESCO. I think a lot of synergy with the UN decade, because culture is one thing that is very important if you want to have a successful decade. Then synergies through various programs. I told you, education, culture, policy, and capacity building. And there are three specific programs that I want to highlight. Is the World Heritage Convention, the Geoscience program, and the MAB program. And these three programs are something very special to bring to the UN decade. This is UNESCO designated sites, which are demonstration sites for ecological restoration already. And we are around 2,000, we have around 2,000 sites all over the world. And really, I think that using this designated site as demonstration areas will really upscale the impact of the UN decade. So may I have the next slide, just to present shortly what we are already doing. Okay, so here I just put three examples. One, biosphere reserve in Colombia, the Seafloor Biosphere Reserve, where we have been through the restoration of the project, and it was done alongside with artisanal fishermen communities. With the World Heritage Convention, we had a multi-billion decade-long investment to restore the wetlands of the Everglades National Park World Heritage Site in the US. And within the GeoPark, the Geoscience network, we have been working on land restoration in abandoned mine sites. And we have assessed and identified 70 locations in Africa where really land restoration would be very much needed. So I will stop here, and just to say that we are delighted to start working on the stakeholders and also partners with UN Decade. Thank you.
Thank you, Noeline, and indeed we are delighted to have UNESCO as such an enthusiastic core partner, and I want to pick up on the restoring of the Everglades, and indeed a multi-billion-dollar decade-long investment. So we all should be aware that we're not talking about continuing with the current model of funding a little project here or there that restores a little bit of ecosystems. If we want to get to 350 million hectares or other targets that have been set, we need to scale this up 100-fold, in some cases 1,000-fold, and that means a transformative change of how we view restoration. This has to become a global multi-billion-dollar conservation and restoration market. We have to increasingly attract private sector funding with public funding as well that will continue to play a role. In the UN Decade Strategy, we estimate around about $1 trillion of investments between now and 2030 that need to flow into restoration, and there is the possibility that this will happen if we all have the imagination and the inspiration to trigger these kinds of investments. They will happen because it is necessary. We will also come back to, Aline, later. There are a number of questions that are coming in that are relevant to what you just presented. And monitoring the chat, I can see that questions are around how to become a partner, what is the timeline, what are the funding options. There are also questions around the technical questions around how to restore, what are the best approaches. We will come back to some of these questions after we've concluded the first round of presentations now. Aline, I see that Justin Adams from the World Economic Forum has managed to log on. Apologies to all our speakers for the difficulties with logging onto our Microsoft Teams platform, but great to have you here now with us, Justin. Aline, if we could go to the 1trilliontree.org slide from the World Economic Forum, and afterwards we'll come to the youth. Justin, over to you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you and congratulations to all the UN Decade team. I know how much hard work has gone into getting to this point, and it's an extremely exciting and important initiative to move forward. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about why the World Economic Forum is getting involved, and crucially how we are looking at how we putting all of our assets in service of the UN Decade. The WEF launched a new platform focused on restoration. It was termed the Trillion Trees platform at Davos in January of this year. That is really an initiative all about ecosystem restoration. Whilst it talks about a trillion trees, as I hope becomes apparent as I talk, it is really not about just planting trees. It is about ecosystem more broadly. But for our message, for so many of the audiences that we want to reach, for corporates, for communities, it is much easier for them to understand the relationship to a tree and the idea that this has to be done at a very, very significant scale than to bamboozle them with all of the science that we know is essential if we're going to deliver restoration and deliver quality restoration that the world needs over the next decade and indeed the decades moving forward. So 3 areas where we believe that the WEF can play a really critical role to support the UN Decade. Number 1 is to raise ambition. We've heard already about some of the country programs. We've heard very little on this call about the corporates, and there is increasing interest from a whole variety of corporations that really do want to get involved in restoration in a very significant way. And part of what the WEF can bring as an international organization for public-private partnership is to really bring an entry ramp for how corporations, large and small, can get involved in restoration efforts, so that when we have webinars in the future, we'll have many more corporates actually talking about what they can do and how they can be engaged in helping this agenda as well. Secondly is how do we unlock some of the system scale change that we know is going to be necessary. Tim talked about not just more projects as usual, but this has got to then come from what is the policy innovation, what's the market innovation, what are the finance mechanisms that might be needed to really try and drive some of this, and also how are we going to monitor progress for the decade for these ambitious goals that we're setting for ourselves going forward. So what are these systemic levers? And then lastly, what can we do to really invert the power pyramid? So this cannot be a decade that is just about the elites. We've already heard the UN talk about new power. We've heard great intervention from Selena from the Global Landscapes Forum. And so WEF as well is looking at how can it put some of its digital tools to support the bigger community that's out there, to support some of the grassroots innovation and to allow that to start be bubbling up rather than everything being imposed top down. And so that's also something we are looking to try and do. We're looking to non-conventional partners for the World Economic Forum of what we can do to support that. But all of this will then be put in service of the UN decade to see what we can try and do. One specific region that we've focused on in the last few months, literally we only launched 4 months ago, but in the last few months there's been a focus on the United States, and that will launch as a new initiative at the end of June. I think the US can bring an awful lot to this discussion overall in terms of the science, in terms of the corporates, in terms of the policy innovation from cities through states up to the federal level. So I think there's a lot that can be brought there, but the WEF is also looking actively at which other regions can we support and can we bring our support and resources. So if there's areas that people on this call feel that we could help with, please do get in touch, put something up on the chat, but happy to connect further. With that, I'll hand back to you, Tim. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much, Justin. Indeed, great to have the World Economic Forum and 1T.org such a committed partner in seeing the progress that is happening. I'll pass later some of the questions over to you. I'll already mention some of them that are bubbling up on the chat. Somebody representing a company is saying, how can I get involved? That is right up your alley, Justin. So related to that, several commentators have reacted to this transformational shift away from small projects to program thinking and multi-billion-dollar investments. I will give that opportunity also to others on the panel to later reflect and come in on that. I wanted to highlight that seems to be a recurring theme. We also have questions on how the feedback people who are in the audience gave on the strategy was considered. Meta, I'll give that to you later because we discussed that just today on our coordination call, so the information is very fresh on how all the feedback on the strategy will be considered. There are more questions coming in. Please don't be shy to keep asking. We have a lot more than we can probably answer on this call, but as I said, we will try to post information in the coming weeks that will allow all of you to either see the answer or give you a chance to provide the answer, because certainly we don't have all the answers, which is why we want to run this decade as a new power model. The answers are out there in the audience. You have most of the answers. What we want to provide is an umbrella and a platform that allows all of the restoration activities that are already ongoing and many more to be successful. With that, I see that finally, and big apologies again to Sasha and to Adriana for the dial-in difficulties with Microsoft Teams, but finally I think Adriana managed to dial in. So sorry, but we're going back to IUCN and your slide now. Please, Adriana Vidal from IUCN joining us from Washington.
Thank you very much, Tim. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Oh
my God, this was a real struggle. I'm very happy it's working. All right, thank you very much, everybody, to all the audience and presenters for such a interesting information and comments shared on the web platform. I wanted to provide some remarks from IUCN regarding our participation and support for the implementation of the decade. For 3 decades, IUCN has established a strong evidence base, practical tools, and policy models that leverage the society-environment interdependencies for more sustainable use of the planet resources. This work culminated in a new paradigm for conservation called nature-based solutions for societal challenges. The three pillars of MBS are protection, restoration, and sustainable use of ecosystems. IUCN has been deploying approaches like forest landscape restoration for years to inform and establish the role of large-scale restoration for the sustainability of the planet and well-being of people. In fact, it was at a Bonn Challenge meeting in 2018 where El Salvador tabled the proposal for the decade. IUCN provided technical and political support to develop an international campaign that catalyzed support by UNEP, FAO, and GLF and made the decade on ecosystem restoration a reality. IUCN is proud to be part of the core group leading the design and execution of the decade's strategy. As mentioned before, the decade builds upon existing restoration initiatives. The Bonn Challenge is the largest global restoration initiative on terrestrial ecosystems, including forests and other landscapes in which trees play a role. 63 national and subnational governments have pledged to bring over 173 million hectares under restoration by 2030. The implementation of these pledges is an important pillar to achieve the vision of the decade. Talking about action, countries are demonstrating that planned restoration at scale is transforming economies, ecosystems, and livelihoods. IUCN has supported countries to apply the Bonn Challenge Barometer to collect political, economic, financial, and biophysical data about their progress. Our data from 2018 show a 56% on-the-ground implementation rate in an assessment of 19 countries. Other tracked data includes an additional 354,000 jobs, an average investment per hectare of at least $235, and 1,379 billion tons of CO2 equivalent sequestered. This year and next one, the barometer will expand its application to 40 more pledgers and will publish a new report next year, so stay tuned. This means that we are entering the decade with a good base of ambition, political drive, and evidence of the impacts of restored ecosystems contributing to the decade's goals. The decade provides a fundamental opportunity to trigger increased and transformative action, including engagement with a wider base of stakeholders, innovative collaboration and partnerships, financing for restoration, and increased capacities to implement ecosystem restoration. Increased capacities on the ground necessitate sound science, and to accelerate action, IUCN will launch a scientific board to generate base knowledge on ecosystem restoration. We will tap into our 10,000 strong pool of experts for this. Also, IUCN will capitalize on its asset of over 1,300 members from government, civil society, and indigenous peoples organizations from 170 countries, mobilizing its constituency to bring on existing initiatives to restore ecosystems, making them not only more visible to the world, but with the plan of facilitating connections and partnerships that will allow scaling up and replication. For this purpose, in January 2021, during the World Conservation Congress in Marseille, France, IUCN will launch Communities of Action for the decade. We have begun to reach out to our members, probably many have joined this call, to organize how to be part of these communities. Finally, IUCN will deploy some of our flagship tools to monitor progress on ecosystem restoration from two different fronts. First, we began expanding the application of the Barometer of Restoration Progress to other ecosystems, and will be piloting actions in some countries during this and next year. Second, building on the Red List of Ecosystems launched in 2014, IUCN will produce by 2021 guidelines for assessing ecosystem risk and developing indicators to monitor ecosystem status as a result of restoration activities. We can use the Red List of Ecosystems to provide baselines and track risk change in support of the decade. That's the main points I wanted to make. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Adriana, and already to alert you to the fact that there's a few questions that came in on how to ensure the ecological integrity of restoration and that we avoid afforestation that damages biodiversity. I will pass that question over to you later, and maybe you can also then say a little bit more on the nature-based solutions guidelines from IUCN and how One Challenge deals with this. Thank you for that. We now, I think, finally have our colleagues from the CBD who managed to log in. Alexander Shestakov. Hello, Sasha. I'm very sorry for the difficulties to log in, but I hope you are on the call now. And I think Aline went back to the slide from the CBD. So if you are there, over to you. Let's see if we have Alexander on the presentation, on the presenters list. No, it looked briefly like he was able to log in, but then it seems it did not work. So apologies to the CBD colleagues if you're in the audience. We'll try WebEx next time. Teams Live does not seem to be really conducive to this. So Aline, if we can go back to the youth representatives, and we'll ask Teresa to present next. Teresa Oberhauser is one of the 2 elected youth representatives in UNEP's major groups. Teresa and Yugratna Srivastava, her colleague, have together led a global youth consultation that has and Teresa, thank you so much for doing that and for being on the call today. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. As already mentioned, my name is Teresa Oberhauser. I'm one of the 2 global focal points for the major group of children and youth towards UNEP. I'm here together with Yugratna, my colleague. We are the official youth engagement mechanisms towards UNEP, and I'm here on behalf of a UN major group of children and youth today. In the framework of the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, the strategy for the UN Decade mandates the MGCY, the major group of children and youth, to organize youth engagement within the framework of this tremendous strategy. And we're really happy to be here today with you and to present you a bit more about what is going to happen, what we're going to do. In 1992, the UN established that it would be good to have stakeholders like the youth involved in a bit more strategic way in its different mechanisms, and that is when the major group of children and youth came to be. Major group of children and youth is the official engagement mechanism within the UN system that comprises over 8,000 youth organizations worldwide that work in with the different UN bodies and in the different processes, also beyond the UN, across everything from labor to human rights to environmental topics, climate topics, and so on. And as already mentioned, it is extremely crucial in nowadays, looking at the developments of the young people on the streets, to actually include young people in those kind of strategies and the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And we're extremely thankful for all the cooperation we've had with UNEP, FAO, the Rio Conventions, WEF, and other stakeholders. Beyond that, for the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, we are convening the youth engagement in the entire process. It is a process that is open by design, which means all young people, all youth organizations can be part of this joint process, this democratic process, to actually engage and help in this process, not just ad hoc through basically engaging young people in single webinars or single points, but to actually be involved throughout the whole process in a strategic way. And that whole process is based on equity principles and a meaningful engagement, which means their participation is purely universal, it is volunteer-led, and it is youth-led. And we've done a lot over the last 6 months already. Just to give you some highlights, there have been more than there have been youth consultations conducted in more than 20 countries, which means young people on the local level from different organizations have consulted on the topics of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration and on how young people can actually be a driving force in that and part of that process that encourages this process. Further on, we have conducted interagency consultations with, for example, also the Rio Conventions, with IUCN, we have been in consultations with WEF, who has been involved in further partners in that entire process. There have been several internal briefings as well, and of course the summarizing of the results from more than 20 youth consultations across 5 different continents. Further on, we've established that that engagement process in a more structured way. So there's a website now, youthenvironment.org/restoration decade, which you can find if you get to youthenvironment.org, where we are actually bringing young people from all different backgrounds together to engage in that process in a structured way from now on over the upcoming 10 years. For the next steps, we have a Youth Environment Assembly coming up next week, a 4-day event convened by the major group of children and youth towards UNEP, but with many engagements of other youth constituencies, including the Rio Convention, where we also have high-level guests, ministers, CPR members. We also gladly have the Special Envoy Kiribati confirmed, Special Envoy for the food systems. So that is also one of the processes where we'll continue those consultations on youth engagement. Further on, there will be consultations up to HLPF, and there will eventually be the convening of a youth stakeholder groups that actually consistently convenes these youth voices and their input to the UN Decade Strategy. Further on, regional youth environment assemblies will be conducted, and there will be more engagement with other UN agencies, with the UN Rio Conventions, and with WEF. And we also invite, first of all, everyone who works with young people, obviously, to get engaged through youthenvironment.org. But most importantly, we invite all member states and all further partners to get in touch with us to see how you can support youth engagement further, how we can cooperate in facilitating youth engagement across different agencies, across different countries. We're very happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and also to Yuratna, who's on this call as well, for everything that you've done in preparation of the strategy and for this enthusiasm amongst the youth networks. We continue to receive chat questions, and also on the chat, if you see, my colleague Oscar has posted a poll. I hope it works. If you click on that, we would also be very keen for everybody in the audience to fill out the quick poll with a few key questions of how you have been, how you want to be involved in the UN Decade. And I hope, Oscar, you will continue to help me to monitor the chat. We now have about 10 minutes to do one quick round of trying to answer some of the questions on the chat. And at the end, my colleagues from FAO will summarize our discussions. See if Eduardo is on the call. No, not yet. So Mette, that task might also fall to us. So we're trying now to summarize some of the chat questions. I see some of you, the panelists, have already started to answer some of the questions on the chat directly. But I'll try to outline a few groups of questions that came in, and I'll start with Mette. There were a few questions on the timeline. When will this final strategy be launched? How will we know if our feedback has been on the strategy has been recorded? And also, what does the funding mechanism look like, and will there be opportunities for grants? Mette, if you can take that first volley of questions. Justin, I'll come to you afterwards with this question of how can we really scale up? Because this is a challenge that needs a scaling up by a factor of probably 100 and maybe more. How can we do that, and what factors are required? But we'll start with Mette, and then I'll come to the other panelists. But any panelist who wants to add to the answers, please let me know, and I will call on you as well. Mette, over to you if you're there.
Let's try. Thank you, Tim. and thank you for the questions. Clearly, as I mentioned, we have received some 1,500 comments on the draft strategy. So at the moment, we're very busy trying to incorporate those. What we would do is that we would acknowledge the receipt of all of the comments that we have received. We will tell you in sort of broad terms of how we have incorporated those, but we can't go back and tell everybody exactly what we have done with each individual comment, and I'm sure that you can understand that. But we will take them into account, and if we can't put them into the strategy itself, we will certainly take them into account in the implementation of the strategy. We're also looking to see, because we've got a lot of comments about new initiatives and people that want to talk about what they have been doing. So we will set that up on our website or our platform so that everybody can do that, and we can include the ones that we have received so far, but also open it up to others, because we can't include them. We talked about including them in an annex to the strategy, but that's a document that will be finished at some point, and it's a shame that we then miss out on a number of other initiatives. So we want to do that online. The strategy itself, we hope we will be able to launch it in July, or at least be ready with it, and then we will see. It may take a little longer depending on how substantive some of the comments are, how much we need to change. So far, they've been very, very positive, most of them, so thank you for that, and some great ideas on that. The other question was on the grants. We are setting up, as I said, this multi-partner trust fund, and there are various windows in that. And one of them is to try and channel support to initiatives on the ground. But we don't want to be sort of the bottleneck, if you will. As I said, we want to establish some sort of marketplace where those who have ideas for restoration initiatives on the ground can put those up, and those who are willing to support those financially can do so. We don't need to be involved with that, but we would set up a system where this can be done. There are a number of other opportunities for grants as well. I think we would certainly encourage people to look elsewhere. The Global Environmental Fund has for the small grants, for example, the JEF small grants scheme might be one opportunity. There may be many others, but we will make some of that information available on the website as well, so we can channel people in the right direction. I hope that answered most of the questions that we had in this round. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mette. And one more just came in that's related to that. Is there a communication strategy? And the answer is yes. We're still working on that, though a small public-facing summary is already on the website, but we're still working on the communication strategy. Thank you very much, Mette. The billion-dollar question next goes to Justin. How do we really scale up restoration efforts over the next decade? Not that you are supposed to have all the answers, Justin, but the answer is up to all of us, but at least you can make a start for it.
I certainly haven't got all the answers, but I think we all would agree that we've got to move from a decade or several decades of talking about this, of commitments and of some really good projects, to actually a decade that sees real innovation and real investment at a scale that's going to be required to get close to the goals that are laid out here. So that's what we need. I think the first thing I would say is it's got to be multi-stakeholder. And by that, I mean, we can't just continue where NGOs are doing really good projects. They know what to do, they know, but how do we actually bring the government together? How do we bring private sector together and really look at some of these innovative partnerships that could unlock the scale? So lots of there's a really good question in the chat, and I have to say the engagement in the chat has just been terrific. It's wonderful to see how engaged everybody is. But there's a really good question in there around, well, how do we bring private sector into this? It's not just a source of money, right? So if we continue to see corporates as just another form of philanthropy, we're also going to fail. Right, so how do we actually engage corporates in a way that they can bring some of the skills they've got to do things at a bigger scale than NGOs could ever dream of. And I say that not without a recognition that there's a dark side that can come from corporates. And I think we've seen a lot of that in terms of sort of, you know, just the general state of the economy right now. But there's also a lot of good that can come if corporates get it right. And so how do we bring that in place? So that's going to require that safeguards are there. So there's lots of questions around principles for MBS. How do we define MBS? We can figure that stuff out. I'm not saying there's not risks, but if we equally turn our back on the huge interest that is there from corporates right now, then we will also fail. We've got to be clear in terms of what we want when we mean finance and how do we unlock finance at a significant scale. We've got to get clear as to whether carbon finance has any role to play here within safeguards, or whether, again, we want to turn our back on that as a potential source of finance to drive some of the restoration that we so dearly want to see at a scale. So there's some really challenging questions that we're going to need to grapple with, and we're going to need to grapple with some of those as a community to actually figure out what the right path forward is. And the last thing I would say is that the COVID crisis that we are still right in the middle of around the world it is both an enormous threat right now, and we know what's happening to many conservation and protected areas around the world, but it also provides a real opportunity. But it will only be a real opportunity if we can make a compelling case for the enormous stimulus that is coming from governments around the world, from how ODA is going to be rechanneled around the world, to be investing in resilience and the resilience of communities and people who've been so desperately impacted, and the resilience of our landscapes. And I suspect everybody on this call understands those interlinkages. Everybody understands how many jobs could be created if we get the stimulus right. But none of us should underestimate that there are all sorts of other forces that are saying we just got to put the money into the aviation sector or into the energy sector, or because that's how we're going to protect jobs and restart the economy. And so if we do not mobilize and really get clear on that economic stimulus and the role governments can play, and how governments can then work with NGOs, can work with communities, can work with businesses, we can spur more eco-innovation and ecopreneurs, then we will not be able to achieve the goals of the decade. We haven't spoken much about COVID, but it is both the biggest existential crisis we face, but it also the potential for a huge reset. And that's also something the WEF is very focused on right now. If people have case studies, it's extraordinary how few economic case studies there are. So if people have them, please do share them. And together we need to actually build this case. So governments, the EU came out with some really good signals today, but don't underestimate how many member states are also being pulled in different directions by different constituencies. So, you know, and Japan came out with it today as well. We have an opportunity, but it's a very small window to act. And that's probably the biggest call I would make for anybody that has that on the call today. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that passionate, very clear outline of how we will succeed, Justin. I think the time has come for this scaling up, and we are there. We can take care indeed of these safeguards and other issues, and we can scale up with the current interest that there is in restoration. We're quickly running towards the end of the webinar, and I wanted to ask all of you to just be very brief in your responses, and I will address one question to both Louise and Peter, which seems to be tailor-made for you. How can the decade trigger more synergies among the Rio conventions, given that next year is one of the very few years, I don't know if it's ever happened, that all the 3 COPs of the Rio conventions are in the same year? Louise, do you want to start?
I can start, certainly. I'll hand over to Peter in a minute because we're completely synergistic on this. Yes, we totally agree. This is totally unexpected for us that everything would be happening in the same year. We have already had a joint liaison group of the meetings of the heads of the different Rio conventions to start plotting, and we get operational tomorrow, so that we very much hope that we can have a kind of plan to the end of 2021 in place, that we work out how we leverage off each other and leverage off the decade as well to deliver the most impact. I totally agree with how Justin just said. I think that the timing is disastrous and perfect at the same time. And I think if we can make the case that the right thing, the right time, the right scale, doing this together, having a strong common messaging that runs throughout all of the events. Yeah, I think it's something we're very aware of, and we're working on it.
Perfect. Thanks, Louise. Peter, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, not much I can add, but just say that we are fully aware that there is a lot of room for synergy in what we work on. Now we see in particular, for example, the post 2020 biodiversity targets. A lot of this stuff is also relevant for climate change and land degradation and so on. And of course, we sort of discuss this, and we have the a little bit different parties to the different conventions, but yeah, there's a lot of room for synergies, and we are trying to do our best in this regard.
Perfect, thanks. And I'm sure if Alexander could have joined us, our CBD colleague, he would have echoed those sentiments, because we have discussed this in this group before, and I know you're all very keen to move forward on these synergies. Very briefly, if I may, Teresa or you, Gratna, if either of you could take the point on how to become engaged and outline this idea of a digital hub, not only for youth, but for other key stakeholders as well. Do you want to take that one, you, Gratna, or Teresa?
Sure, Tim. Do you hear me? I don't know if this is actually awesome. No, I think I would like to start by, sorry, I've been a bit active in responding to some of the comments in the chat that are coming up, but I think, you know, the essential part of this is that if we have to move into the decade of action, the decade of ecosystem restoration, we have to move together with a collective approach. So that means all actors that we see here, whether that is governments, whether that is stakeholders, whether that is private sector, has to, you know, play a part in as a form of a common narrative that we are trying to build and that we are trying to implement. And in this, if you look at, I mean, Justin talked about how we get corporate actors involved, how we get private sector involved, and we heard from different UN partners. I think essential to this is how we also get some of the right holder groups involved, right? I saw some comments in the chat about what about landowners, what about peasants group, and I think the CSM mechanism to CFS, the civil society mechanism, has these different groupings already. Similarly, if you look at what UNEP has a whole constituency of indigenous peoples. There was a comment in the chat about them. So I think the key component is how do we get all of these actors in a way that they're right holders and they're already involved, that we're inclusive by design. We are giving a space for everyone to like make their opinions, to shape this strategy, and at the same time we are bringing the right actors on board who have, you know, the potential to implement it. And this is something that we have to indeed develop moving down the road. The coherence between the UN agencies, and not just between the Rio Conventions and UNEP, but also within UNEP and within FAO, when you look at MEAs or when you look at different divisions, has to be done in a much, you know, effective manner. And I was happy to see some comments from our colleagues from Ramsar Convention. I think there were also some colleagues from the Regional Seas Convention who are very happy to like get engaged in this, and that is, I think, very, very essential to utilize that. And this is also what we have, you know, in part done within the UN major group. That is, we have brought these right holder youth constituencies to different UN processes, stakeholder processes together as a movement to coordinate and not necessarily to represent youth. And this is a space for everyone sort of to, you know, have their voice by design, and this is something that we need to look for when moving ahead into the decade implementation as well. And I think my message is that we all have to work together, different actors have to come together, and COVID-19 has provided us this unprecedented opportunity at the same time, while giving us this unprecedented crisis, to take action, to really, you know, get things moving. And I hope we can continue this momentum. If there are member states listening, please invest into this. If there are private sectors in this call, please step up and do your part. Thank you.
Always very inspiring to listen to you, Gratna, and the youth network activists. This is so encouraging to hear this. Thank you so much. We're running out of time, but I'm very keen to show the audience a sneak preview of the UN Decade Visual Identity, which is now finally designed. So I hope we can quickly do that and click through that. I will quickly come back to Adriana, if you can say something on the standards and avoid afforestation. Norleen, I have one question for you on how we can foster a culture of restoration and how we can provide inspiration and imagination, because this is also has a very cultural element. Aline, if you can quickly scroll through this, the logo deck, this will be the visual identity of the decade, and we will hopefully launch this quite soon, though probably only in September, together with a toolkit for all of you in the audience to become involved with your organization, your government, your NGO, your restoration activity. And you will have the chance to lock up this logo with your own logo. I don't know if you can go down a few more slides, Aline, so just keep on going. The logo builds on some of the elements that are in the strategy. We just keep flicking through, and has a human touch to it, as you can see. We hope it will be memorable and easy to replicate, even for grassroots activities. We're quite pleased also with the opportunities to replicate this in different colors, different languages. So this will be the visual identity. And if you go back to the panel view, Aline, and this will be a hashtag for the UN Decade. This is something to look forward to. Thanks to World Economic Forum for the in-kind contribution to let us use your comms agency for designing this. That was very useful. So going back to the panel view, Aline, and last answers from Noeline, Adriana, and Selina, if you also want to come in on the how to get involved point. We will then close this webinar after that. Noeline, if you want to start with how to foster a culture of restoration.
Thank you, Tim, for this question. It's difficult to answer in a nutshell, but I think that we cannot disconnect culture with education. Culture is something that you get through your education from your parents, from your community, from your teachers, So I think that one thing that we didn't discuss a lot in this panel was the role of education for the UN Decade. And for me, this decade is only a kickstart of something that will have to last for the next generations. It's not for our kids, it's for a lot of generations after us. So for me, I think that having a culture of restoration is based on education, and not only education of the young, it's a long life education, a lifelong education to all of us. And to have also a culture of restoration, the restoration activities has to be inspirational, and they have to be innovative somehow, because we have been through a lot of, as you said in the start, team, piece and pieces of restoration activities. But I think that we really need to have a massive action on that. And with a massive action, I think that we can really go through activities and through a movement that will, where the culture of restoration can come up out of it. So I will stop here, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Noeline. We are now at the end of the allotted time, and I would like to ask Adriana very briefly if you can say something about the guidelines used for One Challenge and other key efforts. And Selina, if there's anything you want to add afterwards on how to get involved. And then I'm afraid we have to close. Our slot on Microsoft Teams is coming to an end.
All right.
Adriana, please.
Thank you, Tim. I've seen the comments and concerns about ecosystem integrity, how nature-based solutions is used to promote certain types of activities. For that, I would just say that the decade strategy, it's certainly going to promote knowledge generation, capacities, and science to inform the sound ecosystem restoration activities. There is a lot of knowledge out there already about how to do restoration in a way that benefits both the ecosystem integrity, and at the same time addresses human well-being. We know that there is a lot of work to be done, but we're going to gather partners, organization leaders on the topic, scientists, and other people and organizations that really can bring this knowledge into the decade. And then the decade's strategy is basically trying to mainstream all that knowledge out there for executors or implementers to be guided by these key principles and information and science. I'll be happy to send this information specifically to people who are interested. So I'm going to send my email on the chat. But there is already information about guidance for ecosystem integrity, nature-based solution, particularly where IUCN launched the standards last year, and this year it was officially adopted. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Adriana. Salina, any additions to any of the questions or to participation before we close?
Sure. I think it's been a great conversation, but what I want to stress is that those of us who are here on the stage, we are not necessarily the true leaders of the UN decade. It's everyone who's on this room. It's everyone who will watch the webinar after, who's going to lead on this for the next 10 years. And it's bigger than one person or one organization. And so that is going to help us get the spirit that we need and the framework and the frame of mind I think that we need to make sure that we're doing this in the next 10 years and it's a success. So in terms of how to join, I would say, definitely if you're joining the GLF community, this is a community of practitioners, of people who want to take action that will be plugged into the decade as new developments evolve, as we build the digital hub, as we have new calls to action on how we need to mobilize our community. A lot of that strategy is still yet to come, but the action is already being done. And I think there's an opportunity for us. The decade is an opportunity to go bigger than we ever have before. And Justin touched on this in terms of private sector. We've had a great community talking about restoration and reforestation and ecosystem management for a long time. And now it's about connecting to new movements, whether that's rewilding, whether that's climate change, whether that's just looking at green development as a whole. This is really bigger than I think the conversations we've had in the past. And so I think if we all gear ourselves up for that, then we'll be ready to hit the ground running when the decade starts.
Indeed, beautiful closing words. There's not much to add to that, unless Mette, you want to add anything from FAO's perspective as our co-lead agency.
Just to say on behalf of Eduardo Mansour, who's in the audience but can't become a presenter because we have some technical problems, just to say thank you very much to everybody. Also to just echo the voices that we've heard already. If you have good examples, good stories, good information, good data, please share it with us. If you have good ways of monitoring success, please share that with us, because we want to make this available to everybody. We want to set up a monitoring system that can capture everything from the small scale restoration in the schoolyard to large scale investments in restoration. And we want to hear how we can restore different types of ecosystems in different contexts and have that information available in different languages. So please get in touch with us through the website or the contacts that you have seen here today, and let us have some of that information so that we can help share that with others. So thank you very much for listening today. It's been wonderful to have you engaged in a conversation with you and with the many, many questions that you've had so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Mette, and thank you also to our over 300 people in the audience and being so active on the chat. Thank you to all the presenters for your insights. It's a great teamwork, fantastic to work with all of you. We will have more core partners. We will have hundreds, hopefully thousands of contributing initiatives and networks over time. The next webinar will be on WebEx, not on Microsoft Teams, so apologies for the glitches in logging in, but it worked out in the end. Thanks to all of you, and let's restore the planet. It's necessary. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.